was just incorrigible. He was impossible in the classroom, and by the time he was, I'm sure today they'd have a medication for him, and that would have been it. But he dropped out of high school and he went right to work. He had already discovered his love of music. He got a job in a publishing house. This was just before the big breakthrough of recordings. There were some recordings. I should say he was born in 1898 to a Jewish American family. They're both from Russia, his parents, both born in Russia. He was born in the United States, in New York City, where he was one of a reasonable number of Jewish American composers of that era who helped develop the Broadway musical, Irving Berlin, perhaps the most famous, Jerome Kern, many others. But at 15, he gets a job in a publishing house. There are some recordings around, but the big money in the music business is sheet music, published sheet music. People still had pianos in their homes. You couldn't be a middle-class home without a piano in those days. And so everybody had a home. That was the home entertainment center, the piano. And the music was somewhat simplified and that would get published. But if you owned a music store in Akron, Ohio, and you wanted to know what sheet music should I have in my store, you'd go to New York, where the business was. That was the heart of it was practically the entire music business of the United States was located on just a few streets in New York City. And every publishing house had somebody in the house who could play the sheet music to demonstrate to that guy from Akron, Ohio, listen to this song. Your people in Akron are gonna love this song. And then George come out and play it. So George's job was to demonstrate the sheet music of the publisher he worked for, and he kept trying to get the publisher to publish his songs. He was already trying to write songs at 15, and he lost a couple of jobs because he kept playing his own songs, which weren't published. And so finally, we're not paying you to play your songs. So 16, 17, he gets a few odd jobs as a rehearsal pianist and things like that. But then at 19, talk about in a hurry, he's in despair. He's saying, I can't get started in this business. Well, he was sitting around with a friend, and they thought, how do you get into this business? Well, one way, that's still true today, by the way, can you get your song sung by a famous performer? So if you're a young songwriter today, if you can get Beyonce to sing your song, you might not become famous. Nobody really knows who writes those songs. You might not become famous, but you're in the business. The biggest performer of his day was a man named Al Jolson. And being a small business, everybody knew somebody who knew somebody. And they managed to get a song to him that he liked. And at 19, he wrote his first song that became a hit, and it's called Swanee. Swanee is a river in South Carolina, which he never saw, but there was a kind of, Jolson did a kind of act where he often sang songs about going back to the American South. There are a whole number of songs in the United States like that. My Old Kentucky Home, Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, Way Down Upon the Swanee River. And so Gershwin thought, well, that's a type of song I can write. And even though he probably never went as far south as New Jersey, he did write. That song became a big hit, and while it didn't make him famous, it did put him on the map as a young songwriter to watch for. He always made his living as a songwriter from then on, and we do not have a starving artist here. This is not a starving, unknown artist. He was very well known very soon after this. Well, he went to work writing songs for a show called the George White Scandals, where he met a very important person in his life. There he is on the left. That's Paul Whiteman, who was the director of the music for the George White Scandals. They were the George White girls, the chorus line of the George White scandals. And Mr. Whiteman, who was a young man when he met George Gershwin, they were both very young, and they talked a lot about this concept. Why don't American composers try to incorporate American sounds when they try to write classical music? American composers had always gone over to Europe for training. They would come back sounding like a bad Brahms or a bad whoever, Debussy, whatever. And if you said to them, why don't you, I mean, so many European composers, they would incorporate folk songs, let's say, into their symphonies. Dvorak, famously, Brahms, Haydn. And it was one way to connect people in the audience, their own folk heritage, to the classical world, classical sound. American composers were, partly it was a kind of racism, because so much of American popular songs and sounds come out of African American music, and these white composers were not going to do that. And partly it was just snobbery. There's nothing in American music that you can use. It's not good enough. And so they wouldn't do it. But Gershwin knew that it could be done. And at the age of 25, he and Paul Whiteman decided to put on a concert of American music and would feature a new piece by George Gershwin. So Gershwin said, oh, that's great, I'll write a piece. I've had some ideas about writing a large symphonic type piece with piano solo, and that's terrific. When is this concert? Oh, it's 4 months away. Terrific. Well, Gershwin, being a young man, promptly forgot about it. And 6 weeks before the concert, an article appeared in the trade papers, in a musical trade paper, that said that young composer George Gershwin was going to be debuting a new piece on the Paul Whiteman show. And he almost fainted. He read it, and it brought it all back, and then he sat down. Unlike what I would do, I would have called Paul Whiteman up, and I would have said, yeah, sorry, Paul, I kind of forgot about this. You'll have to do it without me. But he was George Gershwin, so he said, okay. And he wrote Rhapsody in Blue, his first big symphonic work, in 3 weeks. He wrote it as if it was going to be played for 2 pianos, but he knew one piano would be his part, and the other piano would have to be arranged for Paul Whiteman's band, which was done. So Rhapsody in Blue was written in only 3 weeks, although he certainly had thought about it a lot. He probably had a number of melodies in his head, but there was nothing on paper. Nothing on paper. But he did have a vision. And this is one of the most interesting statements of American music, I think, that exists. Gershwin wrote this to a friend about a year after he wrote Rhapsody in Blue, talking about what he wanted to do in his longer pieces, like Rhapsody in Blue. I'd like to write of the melting pot. That's an expression that's lost. That was a common expression about the mixing of all different peoples in America. That's not longer used, but still, I'd like to write of the melting pot of New York City itself, with its blend of native and immigrant strains. This would allow for many kinds of music, black and white. He's very aware, as a number of sophisticated and advanced white musicians were aware, that there was something about African American music, even then, even in the 1920s, that was special to America, special to the sound, and rather than think of it as, well, that's what they do, to see it as an American, as part of the American fabric of life, and to see its value as a great style of music. And in those days, that would have meant the blues. Today, everybody knows the blues. Everybody's heard the blues. Everybody knows, you can go to Japan, and there's the House of Blues. And, everybody has heard the blues. But in the 1920s, Gershwin's writing this piece in 1924, only very sophisticated white people would have known to go up to Harlem or to go to areas where African Americans lived to hear this new, strange kind of music. And when it would get recorded, it was only sold in record stores that happened to be in African American neighborhoods. So these blues songs were not even available in that store in Akron, Ohio. Black and white, Eastern and Western. Now by Eastern, he did not mean Asia. He meant Eastern Europe, where he came from, his family came from, where all these Jewish composers, Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern, Richard Rogers, Harold Arlen, all the composers that pretty much reinvent the American musical in the 1920s, they all had families from Eastern Europe. Irving Berlin was actually born in Siberia. The others were born here from Eastern Europe, Russian Jewish immigrants. So by Eastern, he meant the kind of music that he's writing with his friends, reinventing the music. Western, of course, Western art, Western music, Germany, France, whatever. And would call for a style, and this is the key line, I think, he would call for a style that should achieve, out of this diversity, an artistic unity. New York is a meeting place, a rendezvous. I'd like to catch the rhythms of these peoples, to show them clash and blend. He's trying to imagine a kind of music that would take all the different elements of American music and find a way to create an artistic unity out of them. You know, that is one of the great historic problems, we're not doing very well at these days, of the United States, right? And I mean, you know, taking people from different backgrounds, different races, different places, and try to find a way to have them create a political, social, cultural unity of some sort. Out of diversity, creating unity out of diversity. Creating an artistic unity out of diversity. Well, here are 4 different kinds of music. They were all around when Gershwin was writing. The blues coming directly out of African American music, Latin or Hispanic rhythms. And the jazz musicians in the 20s used to call this the Spanish tinge. I like that expression. The Spanish tinge, which means basically a little bit of Spanish that's coming from south of the American border, mostly through New Orleans originally, New Orleans being a great Caribbean city, you know, coming in contact with so many musicians from Cuba and Mexico and so on. And so there's that. And there was already some music, I'll try to demonstrate that. Ragtime, which was a very popular style that blends African and European music. And the new love song style, the Broadway ballad, the great love songs of Broadway. And these are all different kinds of music, but they're also listened to by different kinds of people. African Americans are listening to the blues, they're probably not going to Broadway shows to watch. Upper middle class white people are going to Broadway shows, they're probably not going up to Harlem to hear the blues. So these are styles that appeal directly to different groups of people. It's Gershwin's vision to find a way to bring them together in one piece of music. Here are some of his inspirations. Here's James P. Johnson, who introduced both ragtime and some of that Spanish tinge concept. We'll hear about that in a minute. Bessie Smith, the great empress of the blues. And Scott Joplin, who wrote the best ragtime, and Jerome Kern wrote the most famous early Broadway songs. But let me go back to here now and see if I can demonstrate a bit with some of the music. So the blues is the beginning, Rhapsody in Blue. That opening melody is classic blues, and it comes back many times. You'll hear that a lot. Keep in mind the long note and then the faster notes. That's how you'll be able to tell it. It comes back. It doesn't always come back as the blues. It comes back more once it comes back like this. It comes back more as a ragtime piece. So he changes the melody from one kind of music to another kind of music. He wants to show these peoples blending. He wants to show them interfusing, interconnecting. So he takes a melody connected with one kind of people, one group of people. He changes the melody, changes the backup, the rhythm, and now the same melody sounds like it's from another group of people. He kind of like blends one to the other. Later on, the Spanish tinge. You know, there had just been the first of the dance crazes in the United States. They all come from south of the border. All the great dance crazes, whether it's the mambo, the tango, the rumba, whatever it is. And in 1923, James P. Johnson had a piece called the Charleston. has the classic Hispanic rhythm. I don't have to teach you this. Long, long, short, long, long, short, long, long, short. So now back to Rhapsody in Blue. That's also in Rhapsody in Blue. And then ragtime, I wish I had more time to explain it, but basically ragtime is a combination of a march and something that's a little more rhythmic in the right hand. And so you get the energy of the march, which is the European style, and the more complicated rhythms which come out of Africa, and blends into ragtime in the United States. And finally, the Broadway ballad. Jerome Kern had written the first ballads that were different. And every composer in America said, whoa, we got to up our game. We have to, he was really seen as this is something different. And Gershwin in particular said, Jerome Kern taught me you could write popular songs and not be ashamed of yourself. Which, in other words, quality is possible. And so the very famous melody of Rhapsody in Blue is actually a Broadway love song without words. So all of these four styles, one from particularly the more the upper middle class white world of Broadway, another style from more the African American world, another from a blend of the two, ragtime, another from Latin. They're all blended in this one beautiful, beautiful piece, which I would like to play for you. I'd like to hear it, so I'll give it a shot. Can we lift, I wonder if we can just lift this lid up here now. And too happy for me. Yeah, you know what? Maybe you can take this too.